The fluorescent lights hum in Division 9 of Cook County Jail. It's 3 a.m., and the air is thick with tension. Behind these reinforced steel doors, over 2,000 men are locked down for the night. But sleep? That's a luxury most can't afford here. This facility holds more than just criminals. It contains some of the most feared gang members Chicago has ever seen. Men who once ruled entire neighborhoods. Men whose names alone could clear a city block. And now, they're all crammed into the same building. See, when gang leaders from rival factions end up in the same jail, the violence doesn't stop. The codes don't disappear. If anything, the stakes get higher. Control is everything. Respect means survival. And one wrong move can cost you your life. Tonight we're going to talk about 4 men. Larry Hoover, Mickey Cobras Lieutenant Gerald Smith, Latin Kings enforcer Augustin Zambrano, and a case so brutal, it still haunts the guards who witnessed it. Cook County Jail processes over 100,000 inmates every single year. At any given time, roughly 80% of the population claims gang affiliation. That's not just a number. That's thousands of men, separated only by cell bars and razor wire, carrying grudges that go back generations. What you're about to hear are documented cases that reveal how power, violence, and survival operate behind these walls. These aren't stories. They're records, court transcripts, witness testimony. The truth of what happens when Chicago's most dangerous come face to face, with nowhere left to run. Before we get started, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I want to know who's out there following these cases with me. Cook County Jail sits on 96 acres in the heart of Chicago's West Side. It's not just one building. It's a complex, 10 separate divisions spread across multiple structures, all connected by underground tunnels and secure corridors. This place is massive. On any given day, there are between 5,500 and 6,000 people held here. That makes it one of the largest single-site jails in the entire country. And here's the thing, most of these people haven't even been convicted yet. They're waiting for trial, waiting for bail, waiting for a lawyer who actually has time to take their case seriously. The guards here, they'll tell you straight up, this isn't a prison. Prisons have order. Prisons have systems that work because inmates know they're going to be there for years, sometimes decades. But jail? Jail is chaos. People come and go, new faces every single day. And that constant rotation means the power structure is always shifting. Now, let's talk about the gangs. Cook County Jail has documented members from over 30 different street organizations: Gangster Disciples, Black Pea Stones, Latin Kings, Vice Lords, Four Corner Hustlers, Mickey Cobras. The list goes on and on. These aren't small groups either. Some of these factions have hundreds of members locked up at the same time. The jail tries to keep rivals separated. They use a tier system. High-risk inmates go to maximum security divisions. Gang leaders get isolated. But here's the problem. There's only so much space. And when you've got thousands of gang-affiliated men all under one roof, separation only goes so far. Fights break out weekly. Stabbings happen. Sometimes, bodies turn up in cells, and the official cause of death gets listed as suicide, even when everyone knows it wasn't. Larry Hoover never raised his voice. He didn't have to. By the time he was locked up in Cook County Jail in 1973, his name carried more weight than most politicians in Chicago. He was 22 years old, and he was already the leader of one of the most powerful street organizations in American history, the Gangster Disciples. Here's what brought him in. February 26, 1973. A 19-year-old man named William Young was shot and killed in an alley on the south side. The murder was execution style, close range, no witnesses willing to talk. But the streets knew, and eventually the police knew too. Larry Hoover had ordered the hit. He was arrested, charged, and sent to Cook County to await trial. Most people thought that would be the end of his reign. Take the leader off the streets and the organization falls apart, right? Wrong. Larry Hoover ran the Gangster Disciples from his cell, not just in Cook County, across the entire city. He held meetings with his top lieutenants during visitation hours. He sent messages through lawyers, through family members, through anyone who could get past the guards without raising suspicion. And here's the thing that made him different from other gang leaders. Larry Hoover was smart. He understood that brute force only gets you so far. He structured the Gangster Disciples like a corporation. There were ranks, there were rules, there was a board of directors, and he was the chairman. While he was in Cook County, the organization didn't just survive, it grew. New sets formed in neighborhoods that had never seen GD presence before. Drug operations expanded. Money flowed in, and Hoover made sure a portion of it went to funding legal defenses for members who got locked up. Inside the jail, Larry Hoover had protection. Other GD members made sure nobody got close enough to try anything. Guards looked the other way when he needed to communicate. Some of them were on the payroll. Others were just too afraid to intervene. In 1973, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 150 to 200 years. But even after he got transferred to state prison, his influence didn't fade. For decades, he continued running the Gangster Disciples from behind bars. It wasn't until 1997, after a massive federal investigation, that authorities finally moved him to ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado. 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No contact with other inmates. No phone calls except to his lawyer. That's where he is right now. And even from there, his name still commands respect on the streets of Chicago. But here's the question nobody could answer back in the 70s. If one man could run an entire criminal empire from a jail cell, what did that say about the system trying to contain him? Now, Larry Hoover was calculated, controlled. He operated with precision. But not every gang leader inside Cook County had that kind of restraint. Some of them ruled through fear. And one of those men was about to show just how far that fear could reach. Gerald Smith didn't play politics. He didn't need strategy sessions or corporate structures. His reputation was built on one thing: violence. He was a high-ranking member of the Mickey Cobras, a faction that split off from the Black P. Stones back in the 1960s. And by the time he landed in Cook County Jail in 1989, he had already made a name for himself as one of the most ruthless enforcers on Chicago's South Side. The crime that put him there? A double homicide in the Robert Taylor homes. 2 men were found shot to death in a stairwell. Both had been tied up before they were killed. Execution style, just like the hit that took down William Young years earlier. But this wasn't about sending a message to rival gangs. This was internal. These men were Mickey Cobras, and word on the street was that they had been skimming drug money. Gerald Smith was arrested 3 days later. No weapon recovered, no witnesses who would testify, but the police had informants, and those informants all said the same thing. Prince G gave the order, and Prince G pulled the trigger. When he got to Cook County, he didn't lay low. He didn't try to keep his head down and wait for trial. He walked into that jail like he owned it, because in his mind, he did. Within weeks, there were reports of assaults in his division. Inmates getting jumped in the showers, cell searches turning up shanks that somehow never led back to anyone in particular. The guards knew Gerald Smith was behind it, but proving it was another story. Nobody wanted to be the one who snitched on Prince G. Here's what made him dangerous. He didn't just use violence for control. He enjoyed it. Other gang members feared him, even the ones who were supposed to be on his side. Because if you crossed him, if you disrespected him, if you even looked at him wrong, there was no negotiation, no second chances. There's a documented incident from his time in Cook County that shows you exactly who he was. Another inmate, the young guy affiliated with a rival set, made the mistake of sitting in what Smith considered his spot in the day room. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but Gerald Smith didn't see it that way. The guards found the kid 2 hours later, broken jaw, 3 cracked ribs, 1 eye swollen shut, and when they asked him who did it, he refused to say, because even after getting beaten half to death, he knew that snitching would get him killed. Gerald Smith's trial started in 1990. The prosecution had circumstantial evidence. They had testimony from informants who wouldn't show their faces in court, and they had a jury that was terrified of convicting a man with his reputation. But the evidence held. He was found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without parole. After the conviction, he was transferred out of Cook County to Stateville Correctional Center, and even there, his violence didn't stop. In 1994, he was involved in a prison riot that left 2 guards hospitalized. In 2001, he was caught with a weapon during a cell shakedown. Gerald Smith is still alive today, still incarcerated, still feared by anyone who knows his name. But here's what his case shows. Men like Larry Hoover could run organizations with strategy and structure. But men like Gerald Smith, they ran on fear alone. And in a place like Cook County Jail, fear can be just as powerful as intelligence. Now, both of these men were dangerous in their own ways. But they were products of Chicago's South Side gang culture, black street organizations that had been around for decades. What happens when you take that same level of violence, that same code of silence, and you add in the structure of a different kind of gang? One with roots that go back further than most people realize. Augustin Zambrano was 51 years old when federal agents arrested him in 2008. By that point, he had spent over 3 decades working his way up through the ranks of the almighty Latin Kings nation. And when they finally took him down, he wasn't just a member. He was the national leader, the corona, the crown. The Latin Kings operate differently than the Gangster Disciples or the Mickey Cobras. Their structure is tighter, more disciplined. They have written bylaws, a constitution, ranks that mirror military hierarchy. And at the top of that pyramid sat Augustin Zambrano. He didn't get there by accident. He got there by being smarter than everyone around him. While other gang leaders were flashy, throwing money around and drawing attention, Zambrano stayed quiet. He ran his operations like a business. Drug trafficking, extortion, weapons deals, all of it coordinated through a network of enforcers who reported directly to him. But what brought federal attention wasn't just the drugs or the guns. It was the murders. Between 1998 and 2008, at least a dozen homicides were tied back to orders that came from Zambrano. Some of the victims were rivals. Others were Latin Kings members who had violated the bylaws. In the Latin Kings, disobedience doesn't get you kicked out. It gets you killed. When the feds finally moved on him, they didn't just charge him with racketeering. They hit him with conspiracy to commit murder, narcotics trafficking, firearms violations. The indictment was 70 pages long, and it detailed a criminal enterprise that stretched across Chicago, into the suburbs, and even into other states. Zambrano was held at Cook County Jail while he waited for trial, and this is where things get interesting. Because even though he was facing life in prison, even though the feds had wiretaps and witnesses and mountains of evidence against him, he still thought he could beat it. From his cell in Cook County, he continued giving orders. The Latin Kings on the outside were told to intimidate witnesses, to pay off anyone who might testify, to make sure the organization kept running smoothly while he was gone. And for a while, it worked. One witness recanted his statement. Another refused to show up to court. The prosecution was scrambling to hold their case together. But here's what Zambrano didn't count on. The feds had flipped one of his top lieutenants, a man who had been with him for over 20 years. And that man was willing to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial started in 2011. It lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented recorded phone calls where Zambrano discussed drug shipments. They showed financial records that traced money back to him. And they put that lieutenant on the stand, where he laid out every single order Zambrano had given over the past decade. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, the verdict was guilty on all counts. Augustin Zambrano was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. At his age, that's a death sentence. He'll never see the outside again. But even after the conviction, the Latin kings didn't fall apart. Another leader stepped up. The structure held. Because that's the thing about organizations like this. They're not built around one person. They're built around an idea. And as long as that idea survives, the gang survives. So what does Zambrano's case tell us? It tells us that intelligence and structure can take you far, but in the end, the system will catch up. The feds have more resources, more time, more patience, and when they decide to take you down, they don't stop until you're buried under evidence so deep that no lawyer in the world can dig you out. Now, we've talked about a calculated leader who ran his gang like a corporation. We've talked about a violent enforcer who ruled through fear. We've talked about a strategist who thought he could outsmart federal investigators. But none of those cases compare to what happened next. Because the man we're about to discuss didn't just break the law. He broke something far worse. And what he did inside Cook County Jail still haunts the people who were there to witness it. March 2014, Division 10 of Cook County Jail, 2:15 in the afternoon. A correctional officer named James Williams was making his rounds through the maximum security tier. He had been working at Cook County for 11 years at that point. He had seen stabbings, he had broken up fights, he had walked past cells where men screamed threats at him for hours on end. He thought he had seen everything this place could throw at him. He was wrong. When he reached cell 47, he stopped. Something was off. The small window in the door was covered from the inside, which was against regulations. He knocked. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He radioed for backup and used his key to open the cell. What he found inside that room would stay with him for the rest of his life. 2 inmates. Both members of the Black Disciples. One of them was 19 years old, barely old enough to vote. The other was 34, a veteran of the gang with multiple priors. They had been cellmates for 3 weeks. The younger inmate was dead. His body was propped up against the wall. And the older inmate was sitting on his bunk, covered in blood, staring at the floor like nothing had happened. Officer Williams called for medical. He called for the warden. He secured the scene. But there was nothing anyone could do. The 19-year-old had been dead for hours. The investigation moved fast. The Cook County Sheriff's Office brought in homicide detectives. They interviewed everyone on that tier. Guards, other inmates, anyone who might have heard something. And slowly, the story started to come together. The 2 men had been arguing for days. It started small. Disagreements about who got to use the toilet first, who got the top bunk. Petty things that wouldn't matter anywhere else, but in a 6-by-8-foot cell. Those petty things become life and death. The older inmate, whose name I'm not going to say because his trial is still tied up in appeals, claimed it was self-defense. He said the younger man attacked him, that he had no choice but to fight back. But the evidence told a different story. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been strangled. Manually. It takes several minutes to strangle someone to death. You have to maintain pressure the entire time. You have to watch them struggle, watch them stop breathing. That's not self-defense. That's murder. But here's what made this case different from every other jailhouse killing. The guards had walked past that cell at least 4 times during their shift. Standard protocol. And none of them noticed anything wrong until Officer Williams saw the covered window. That means for hours, while this young man's body was sitting in that cell, life in Cook County Jail just kept going. Meals were served. Inmates were let out for recreation. Guards filled out paperwork and clocked in and clocked out. And nobody knew. The Cook County Sheriff at the time, Tom Dart, held a press conference 3 days later. He called it a tragedy. He promised a full investigation into how this could have happened. He talked about implementing new safety protocols, better training for staff, more frequent cell checks. But the reality is, nothing changed. Not really. Because the problem wasn't the protocols. The problem was the overcrowding, the understaffing, the fact that guards are responsible for watching hundreds of inmates at a time, and they're expected to somehow prevent violence in an environment where violence is the currency. The older inmate was charged with first-degree murder. His trial started in 2016. The defense argued that he was mentally ill, that he should have never been placed in a cell with another inmate. The prosecution argued that he knew exactly what he was doing and that the murder was premeditated. The jury sided with the prosecution. He was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But that didn't bring the 19-year-old back. It didn't erase what happened in cell 47. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. That young man was in Cook County because he couldn't afford bail. He was arrested on a drug possession charge. Not a violent crime, not a gang hit. He had a small amount of marijuana on him, and because he didn't have $1,500 for bail, he sat in that jail for 3 weeks waiting for a court date. And in those 3 weeks, he ended up locked in a cell with someone who would kill him. So what does this case tell us? It tells us that the system is broken. It tells us that people are dying in Cook County Jail, not because they're dangerous, but because they're poor, because they don't have lawyers who can get them out, because they're stuck in a place where survival depends on luck just as much as it depends on strength. And it tells us that no matter how many gang leaders get locked up, no matter how many federal investigations bring down entire organizations, the violence doesn't stop. It just moves behind bars, where fewer people are watching, where fewer people care. So let's zoom out for a second. Let's talk about what all of this means beyond Cook County. Chicago has one of the highest gang-related homicide rates in the country. In 2023, over 600 people were murdered in the city. Roughly 80% of those murders were gang-related. And a significant number of the people committing those murders had been through Cook County Jail at some point in their lives. Here's the cycle. A young man gets arrested. He's sent to Cook County. He spends weeks, sometimes months, waiting for trial. During that time, he's exposed to older gang members, men who have been in the system for years, men who teach him how to survive, how to fight, how to move product, how to stay loyal. When he finally gets out, either because charges were dropped, or because he made bail, or because he served his time, he doesn't leave the gang behind. He goes back to his neighborhood with new connections, new skills, and a deeper commitment to the organization. Recidivism rates for gang members are staggering. Studies show that over 70% of gang-affiliated inmates released from Cook County Jail are rearrested within 3 years. Most of them for violent crimes. So the jail isn't stopping the violence, it's feeding it. Researchers who study gang culture have been saying this for years. Dr. Andrew Papachristos, a sociologist at Northwestern University, published a study in 2019 that tracked over 2,000 gang members in Chicago. His findings were clear. Incarceration doesn't break gang ties, it strengthens them. When you lock up gang members together, you're not punishing them. You're giving them time to organize, time to plan, time to build relationships that will last long after they're released. And law enforcement knows this. The Chicago Police Department has a gang intelligence unit that monitors activity inside Cook County Jail. They track who's meeting with who during visitation. They listen to phone calls. They try to intercept communications. But they're always one step behind. Because at the end of the day, the gangs have something the police don't. They have loyalty. They have a code that's been passed down for generations. And they have members who are willing to die before they break that code. So what's the solution? Honestly, I don't know. And I don't think anyone else does either. You can't just release everyone and hope the problem goes away. Some of these men are genuinely dangerous. They've committed horrific crimes, and they need to be held accountable. But you also can't keep locking people up in a system that's clearly broken. A system that's overcrowded, understaffed, and unable to provide even basic safety for the people it's supposed to be holding. What I do know is this. As long as Cook County Jail continues to operate the way it does now, the violence will continue, the gang structures will continue, and young men will keep dying in cells while the world outside moves on like nothing happened. So let's go back to the question I asked at the beginning. What happens when the most dangerous gang members from Chicago's streets end up confined together? The answer isn't simple. It's not clean. And it's not something that can be fixed with better policies or more funding alone. What happens is that power doesn't disappear. It just changes form. Men like Larry Hoover prove that you can run an empire from a cell. Men like Gerald Smith prove that fear travels through steel bars and concrete walls just as easily as it travels through city blocks. Men like Augustin Zambrano prove that intelligence and structure can survive even when the leader is taken down. And that case in 2014 proves that sometimes the most dangerous thing about jail isn't the gang members, it's the system itself. These aren't just stories about criminals. They're stories about what happens when we build institutions that we can't control. When we lock people up and then act surprised when violence follows them inside. And we need to remember something. Behind every case I've talked about tonight, there are victims, real people who lost their lives, families who will never get closure, communities that are still dealing with the trauma of gang violence, both on the streets and behind bars. William Young was 19 years old when Larry Hoover had him killed. He had a mother who spent the rest of her life wondering what her son could have become if he'd been given the chance. The two men, Gerald Smith, executed in the Robert Taylor homes, had families too. People who loved them. People who begged them to leave the gang life behind before it was too late. The victims tied to Augustin Zambrano's orders weren't just names in a federal indictment. They were sons, brothers, fathers. And that 19-year-old kid who died in cell 47, he had his whole life ahead of him. He made a mistake. He got caught with a small amount of marijuana. And because he couldn't afford bail, he paid for it with his life. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The next time you hear about gang violence in Chicago, remember that it doesn't stop at the jail door. The next time you hear about criminal justice reform, remember that Cook County Jail is still operating the same way it did 20 years ago. And the next time someone tells you that locking people up will solve the problem, remember that sometimes the cage just makes things worse. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of this story surprised you the most? Did you know about any of these cases before tonight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a real conversation about what's happening inside these walls. And if you want to see more content like this, if you want me to keep covering true crime cases that don't get enough attention, hit that subscribe button. Because there are hundreds of stories like these. Stories that need to be told. Stories that people need to hear. Next week, we're going to talk about another side of Cook County, the women's division. Because while everyone focuses on the men, there's a whole different world happening on the other side of that jail. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. And remember, the truth is always more complicated than it looks.